I can take him away, if that's better. The words slipped out before Tieu Van could stop them. And the moment they did, everything froze. The air, the light, the space between them. Even the wind outside seemed to pause, as if the world itself understood that something had just broken. Trieu Duong didn't move. Not immediately. He stood there, his back slightly turned, one hand still resting on the wooden table, the other holding the edge of the cloth where truck lamb had just been lying moments ago. The baby was asleep now, peaceful, unaware that with one sentence, his world had just been shaken. Tieu Van's breath caught. She hadn't meant it like that. Or maybe she had. She didn't even know anymore. I didn't mean, she started. But the words died in her throat, because she saw it. Not anger, not rage, but something worse. Trieu Duong's eyes. He didn't look at her right away. But when he did, the pain in them was quiet, deep, and impossible to hide. He didn't raise his voice, didn't question her, didn't even argue. He just looked at her for a long second. Then slowly he turned away. That was all. And somehow that hurt more than anything he could have said. If you were in this moment, Tieu Van's thoughts spiraled inside her, her chest tightening. Would you try to explain? Or stay silent like him? Because silence was heavier. Silence meant something had already changed. I didn't mean I would leave, she said again, her voice softer now, almost pleading. I thought maybe he would have a better life. With who? Trieu Duong asked. His voice was calm, too calm. He still wasn't looking at her. With you, he continued quietly. Or without me? The question landed like a weight. Tieu van Franche. She didn't answer, because there was no answer that wouldn't hurt. Trieu Duong let out a slow breath. You said that too easily, he said, still calm, still controlled. But now there was something else beneath it. Disappointment. I wasn't thinking. She tried again. That's the problem. He cut her off. Not loudly, not harshly, but enough. The room fell silent again. The kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full of things left unsaid. Tieu Van lowered her gaze. Her fingers clenched tightly. I thought, she whispered, if it's better for him. And who decides what's better? He asked. This time he turned, finally looking at her directly. His eyes weren't angry, but they weren't soft either. They told you that, didn't they? He continued. Your family, the life you came from. Tieu Van's lips trembled. They're not wrong, she admitted quietly. The moment the words left her mouth, she regretted them, because she saw it again. That shift, something inside him closing. Of course, Trieu Duong said. A faint, bitter smile appeared on his lips. They're not wrong. He nodded slowly. They can give him everything. He looked around the small house, the worn walls, the simple table, the quiet life they had built. Everything I can't. The truth. Simple. Unavoidable. Tieu Van took a step forward. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? He asked. Still calm, still steady. But now his voice was heavier. She opened her mouth, then closed it, because suddenly, she didn't know anymore. Was it about the baby, or was it about her fear, her past, her uncertainty? I just don't want him to suffer, she said finally. Trieu Duong's eyes softened slightly, but only for a second. Do you think I do? He asked. The question was quiet, but it carried everything. Every sleepless night, every sacrifice, every moment he had held that child when no one else did. Tieu Van shook her head quickly. No, I know you don't. Then don't say things like that. His voice dropped, lower, because this time it wasn't anger. It was hurt. I raised him, he continued, from the moment I found him until now. His grip on the edge of the table tightened. I didn't do it thinking someone would come back and decide what's better. Silence. Tieu Van's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. Not yet, because she knew she had crossed a line, not by leaving, but by suggesting she might leave again, even if she didn't mean it. Trieu Duong looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly he shook his head. I'm not angry, he said, and somehow that made everything worse. I'm just... He paused, searching for the word. Tired. Tieu Van's heart tightened. Tired of what? She whispered. He didn't answer immediately. Then, finally, tired of feeling like I can lose him at any moment. The words were simple, but they broke something inside her completely, because for the first time she saw it clearly. Not just her pain, his, and how much of it came from her. I'm here now, she said weakly. But for how long? He asked. She froze, because she couldn't promise forever. Not when her past was still chasing her. Not when her world could still pull her back. Not when even she wasn't sure of herself. Trieu Duong saw the hesitation, and that was enough. He nodded slowly. I understand, he said, but the way he said it meant the opposite. He stepped away, not far, but enough. Enough to create distance. The kind that wasn't physical, but emotional. Tieu Van stood there, alone, even though he was still in the same room. If you were me, she thought, her chest aching, would you stay, or would you leave before hurting him again? No answer came, because for the first time, she realized loving someone didn't always mean staying, and staying didn't always mean you wouldn't break them. The silence didn't end. It stretched, slowly, quietly, like something invisible tightening around both of them. That night, they didn't speak again. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be said had already hurt too much. Truck Lamb slept between them, his small body rising and falling gently under the thin blanket. Unaware, peaceful, Trieu Duong lay on one side, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Tieu Van sat on the other, her back against the wall, knees pulled close. Neither of them slept. At some point, the baby stirred. A small sound. Trieu Duong moved immediately. His hand reached out, instinctively checking, adjusting the blanket, making sure everything was all right. Tieu Van watched. The way he did it, without thinking, without hesitation, as if this had become part of who he was. And suddenly, the weight of her own words came crashing back. I can take him away. She closed her eyes. Tight. How could I say that? But the more she thought about it, the more she realized. It wasn't just a mistake. It was fear. Fear that she couldn't be enough. Fear that staying might hurt them more. Fear that one day she would be forced to leave again. And if that day came, wouldn't it be easier if she left first? If you were me, her thoughts whispered, restless. Would you stay and risk breaking him, or leave before you do? Her chest tightened. No answer. Only the sound of breathing. Slow. Heavy. Trieu Duong turned slightly. Not toward her, but away. That small movement felt like distance. Real distance. And for the first time, Tieu Van felt it. Not just the space between them, but the crack. The one she had caused. The one that might not heal. Morning came quietly. No words. No greetings. Just movement. Trieu Duong got up early. Prepared water. Checked the baby. Everything as usual. Except nothing felt the same. Tieu Van stood near the doorway. Watching. She wanted to say something. Anything. But the words stayed trapped inside. Because she didn't know how to fix something that had already been said. I'm going out, Trieu Duong said suddenly. His voice was calm, but distant. She nodded. Where? She asked softly. Work. Short. Simple. He didn't look at her. He picked up Truck Lamb, wrapped him carefully, then paused. For a brief second, like he wanted to say something too, but he didn't. He just left. The door closed behind him, and just like that, the house felt empty. Not physically, but emotionally. Tieu Van stood there, still, listening, to the silence, to her own breathing, to the echo of something she couldn't take back. Hours passed. She tried to stay busy, cleaning, cooking, moving things around, but nothing worked, because everything reminded her of him, of them, of what she had almost destroyed. By afternoon, she couldn't take it anymore. She stepped outside. The sunlight felt too bright, the air too heavy. She walked, without direction, just walking. If I leave now, her thoughts whispered, maybe it will hurt less. The idea felt familiar, too familiar. Running, avoiding, escaping before things broke completely. Her steps slowed, then stopped, because deep inside she knew, if she left now it wouldn't protect them. It would destroy everything. At the same time, Trieu Duong sat by the edge of the field. Truck Lam rested against his chest. Sleeping, he hadn't done much work. His hands moved, but his mind was elsewhere. I'm not angry. He repeated the words from the night before, but now he wasn't so sure. Maybe it wasn't anger, but it wasn't nothing either. It was something heavier, something harder to fix. Disappointment, because no matter what they had gone through, she still thought about leaving, even if it was just a thought, even if it was fear. That means, he whispered quietly, looking down at the baby, she's not really here. The thought hurt more than anything else, because he had already accepted her past. But he didn't know if he could accept her uncertainty. The baby moved slightly. His small hand reached out, grabbing onto Trieu Duong's shirt again, tightly, as if holding on. And suddenly that feeling came back, that fear, that one day the small hand would reach for someone else, and not him. He closed his eyes. If you were me, he whispered, his voice low, would you hold on tighter, or let go before it hurts more? Still no answer. Evening came slowly. The sky turned orange. Tieu Van stood outside the house, waiting. When she saw him returning, her chest tightened, not from fear, but from something else. Determination. This time she didn't stay silent. She walked forward, stopped in front of him. I'm not leaving. The words came out clearly, without hesitation. Trieu Duong looked at her, really looked, as if trying to see if she meant it. I said something I shouldn't have, she continued, her voice steady but soft. But I'm still here. She took a breath. And I'm not going anywhere. Silence. The kind that mattered. The kind that waited. Trieu Duong didn't respond immediately, because this time it wasn't about words. It was about whether he could believe them. The words stayed in the air. I'm not leaving. Tieu Van didn't look away. Not this time. Her eyes were steady, tired, but certain. Trieu Duong stood there, the baby in his arms, the last light of the evening falling across his face. He didn't answer immediately, because he had heard promises before, not from her, but from life, and life had never kept them. If you were me, his thoughts moved slowly, heavy. Would you believe her now, or protect yourself before it's too late? He looked down at Truck Lam. The baby blinked sleepily, then lifted his small hand, brushing against Trieu Duong's chest, warm, trusting, unaware of the weight carried by the people around him. Trieu Duong exhaled slowly. I heard you, he said, not cold, not soft, just careful.
Tieu Van nodded.
She didn't ask for more, didn't push, because she knew trust wasn't something she could ask for. It was something she had to prove. That night, she didn't sit in the corner. She didn't keep her distance. Instead, she stayed close. Not too close to scare him. Not too far to run away. Just present. When Truck Lam stirred, she moved first. Carefully, gently, she reached out, paused for a second, then continued. She adjusted the blanket. Softly, the baby didn't cry. He didn't push her away. He just stayed asleep.
Tieu Van Franche.
Then slowly, a small smile appeared. Not big, not bright, but real. Trieu Duong saw it. From where he sat, he didn't say anything, but something inside him shifted, just a little. The next morning, the sun rose slowly over the mountains. The light entered the house gently. Tieu Van was already awake. She was in the kitchen, not standing still, moving, preparing water, cutting vegetables, lighting the fire. The sound of cooking filled the space. Trieu Duong woke up to that sound. He sat up, looked around. For a moment, he didn't recognize the feeling. Then he realized, felt like someone had stayed, not just physically, but truly. He stood up, walked toward the kitchen. Tieu Van didn't turn immediately. She was focused, careful, like she was doing something important. "Why are you up so early?" he asked. She paused, then answered quietly. "I wanted to make breakfast. Simple.
No explanation. No justification.
Just action." Trieu Duong leaned against the doorway, watching, not judging, not questioning, just observing, because this was different from words. This was something real. Later that day, they sat together, not facing each other, not far apart, just next to each other. Truck Lam lay between them, awake, curious. His eyes moved, from one to the other. Then he made a small sound, reaching out, first toward Trieu Duong, then slowly toward Tieu Van. Tieu Van held her breath. She didn't rush, didn't panic. She just stayed. And this time, when she reached out, her hands were steady. She touched his small fingers, gently, and he didn't pull away. He held on, just for a moment, but enough. Enough to make everything inside her break and heal at the same time. Trieu Duong watched. His chest tightened, but he didn't turn away. Not anymore, because this time it didn't feel like losing. Felt like sharing. "If love means anything," he said quietly, almost to himself, "maybe it's not about who he chooses." Tieu Van looked at him. "Maybe it's about who stays," she replied softly. Their eyes met.
No arguments.
No fear, just understanding.
Chúc làm lau ghét suddenly.
A small, bright sound. He grabbed both their hands. Not tightly, not perfectly, but together. And that was enough. The wind moved outside. The world continued. But inside that small house, something had changed. Not fixed, not perfect, but real. Because this time no one left. And sometimes that's where everything begins.